you back to the lecture hall. It's so good to see at least part of your faces. And so good to welcome the folks who are home joining us through the live stream. And what a magnificent occasion to gather as we celebrate Ed Simon's brilliant gift to our city, an alternative history of Pittsburgh. Hello, I'm Stephanie Flom, Executive Director of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. And on behalf of our board and staff, again, I can't say it enough, welcome. We have missed you. Made Local is presented in partnership with our friends at the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, and a thank you to the library. A shout out to Whitewell Bookstore, who's here with signed copies of Ed's book. After his presentation, Ed will join me on stage to discuss the great questions that some of you have submitted. A Pittsburgh native and Alderdice alum, Ed had an amazing visit with my alma mater at Alderdice, with students there today. He was welcomed by his former teacher, Dr. Josh Slifkin. Ed, this is your life. Ed is a contributing editor for the History News Network and a staff writer for The Millions, which the New York Times has called the indispensable literary site. He is the author of many books, most recently, of course, An Alternative History of Pittsburgh from Belt Publishing. His new book, Pandemonium, A Visual History of Demonology, will be released soon. And there'll be an event at White Whale, so you'll make sure to check it out. Ed's essays have appeared in The Atlantic, the Paris Review Daily, the Washington Post, McSweeney's, the New Republic, and the New York Times, among dozens of others. The reviews for An Alternative History are glowing. Publishers Weekly called it rich and idiosyncratic. The LA Review of Books called it an epic atomic history of the Steel City. Newsweek named it among their 21 best books to read the week it was published. Pittsburgh Quarterly called it a winner, and the Jewish Chronicle wrote that it is a winner, yes, a sparkling new take on everyone's favorite Rust Belt metropolis. Ed writes in his acknowledgments that he hopes that readers, quote, think it's the sort of book that could only have been written by a Pittsburgher. Well, Ed, with your deep understanding of the nuance and complexity, beauty and betrayals of our burg, you've done precisely that. Please welcome Ed Simon.
Hello, can everybody hear me? I'm not staticky? Okay, excellent. First, a brief excerpt from my introduction. Pittsburgh is stranger and more beautiful than any other place that I've lived, so that it never feels quite normal anywhere other than within the Three Rivers. Pittsburgh is large and multitudinous, multifaceted, multifractured. It is complex, contradictory, and confusing. So I've tried to craft my own idiosyncratic wonder cabinet of representative moments. Think of it as being less of a history than an assemblage of Rorschach ink blots. Not a study or an analysis, but a diary, a dream journal, a wooden shelf packed tight with interesting rocks and shells. To that end, I've borrowed the favored narrative structure of the great Uruguayan historian and essayist Eduardo Galeano, who in Open Veins of Latin America and Mirrors, Stories of Almost Everyone, wrote in a fragmentary, digressive, rhizomatic way, telling histories through a series of related and organized snapshots rather than as some grand teleological thrust of human progress. As with Galeano, who was Uruguayan through and through, and whose books could have been written by nobody but a Latin American, I believe that nobody but a Pittsburgher could have written the book that you're holding. And also, as with Galeano, That means a grappling with not just the light but the dark, not just the sweet but the bitter. This is a book with triumphant things in it, but it is not a book of triumphalism. Some readers looking for Steelers lore, which is in here, or a listing of all of the city's beloved native daughters and sons, who mostly still get their cameos, might be disappointed. If there's any logic to history, that compendium of one thing after the other, it shouldn't be the teleology of progress, but that every damn thing is connected to every other damn thing. A moldering leaf in a prehistoric marsh is 19th century coal. The river confluences spied by a French explorer becomes the major waterway of American expansion. The site where a steel mill or a slag heap once sat is where the newest luxury condominium sits. The set pieces change, but the set stays the same. Narrative continuity is supplied by the book being divided into thirds, with each section loosely connected to a line from the Jack Gilbert poem, which acts as the epigraph of the book. Gilbert was an East Liberty man through and indelibly marked by the city, as we all are, since we can't really leave, so that his searching for Pittsburgh is its own impressionistic history in miniature. The first section, Ox and Sovereign Spirit, looks at Pittsburgh primeval, from the ancient Pennsylvanian period of 300 million years ago, when the terrain and resources of the region were established, until the turn of the 19th century, as the city positioned itself as the first metropolis of the frontier. The second section, City of Brick and Tired Wood, tells the story of Pittsburgh's industry throughout the 19th century, the ways in which both capital and labor transformed the exploding city. The final section follows the story into the 20th century, from Pittsburgh's greatest economic and cultural success through its decline. Appropriately enough, it is titled A Consequence of America, for if the city's narrative is anything, it's that of the nation in miniature. Thank you. That's from my introduction. To move into the talk proper, I would have to say that the first thing that you must understand about an alternative history of Pittsburgh is that it's not a history at all. It's an autobiography. Let me explain. There are multitudes of brilliant studies about Pittsburgh. Martin Arand's erudite The Spectator and the Topographical City about the landscape, Mark Whitaker's exuberant Smoketown, The Untold Story of the Other Great Black Renaissance, John Horr's lyrical And the Wolf Finally Came, The Decline and Fall of the American Steel Industry. Then there are the standard texts, Frank Toker's indispensable Pittsburgh, A New Portrait, and the classic Stéphane Laurent doorstopper, Pittsburgh, The Story of an American City, with its incandescently beautiful photographs by W. Eugene Smith. I'm sure it's on several coffee tables at home. My book isn't a history because it wasn't my intent to do what any of these aforementioned titles already do perfectly. There is no claim to completism in an alternative history of Pittsburgh, no desire or even an ability to be the standard work. I relied on peer-reviewed research, sometimes heavily, but the book itself isn't scholarship. Rather, it's an assortment of events and personalities, anecdotes and arguments, subjective, idiosyncratic, relative, contingent, individual, personal. A brief for what I love about Pittsburgh, but also what's complicated. More than a portrait of Pittsburgh, it's a portrait of a Pittsburgher. My favorite description I read of the book was something somebody posted on Twitter, which is rare. They described the book as flash creative nonfiction, and I think that that's perfect. When writing, I conceived of these miniature chapters as fragments, written not to plumb the depths of Pittsburgh, but to give you a brief glimpse. In their organization, ordering, and relationship to each other, my intent is to imply arguments, but I'm rarely so blatant as to necessarily let you know what I'm thinking. So what I'd like to do tonight is maybe give you a bit more of that sense. Writing is a strange process whereby you sometimes only find out what it is that you actually want to say as you try to say it. While writing this book, certain major themes appeared, and after finishing everything, I discovered that Pittsburgh is defined by place and space, labor and capital, success and decline. There we go. My first section, Ox and Sovereign Spirit, starts 300 million years ago and ends with the 18th century. None of this is mere prologue. I wanted to make Pittsburgh strange, but to also give some sense of that which is persistent. Regarding the latter, as you study the geology, the biology, the anthropology of those years before there was anything even called Pittsburgh, you realize just how much geography is destiny. Easy to pretend that it's only the decisions of exemplary men that chart the destiny, but Pittsburgh is only Pittsburgh because of hills and valleys, mountains and rivers. The internal sense of space in Pittsburgh is what has lent the city its distinctive character, its ambiguous geographic placement between east and west, north and south, the great metropolis of the Trans-Appalachian frontier. Not just geography, but geology. Our natural resources are why Western Pennsylvania became the world's power plant and Pittsburgh its forge. The first chapter begins during the Carboniferous Period, some 300 million years ago, and even more specifically during the epoch which geologists call the Pennsylvanian era, named after us. Hard as it is to imagine now, but everything here, our current site, Schenley Park, Oakland, Pittsburgh, was once part of a tropical rainforest on the edge of a continent named Laurasia, which sat on the equator. An oxygen-rich atmosphere allowed for gigantism among insects, as you can see in my handy middle school science textbook picture. And as fungi had yet to evolve, dead foliage didn't decompose so much as ossify. From these warm water mangroves came the rich veins of coal that thread their way from Canonsburg to Cardiff, the anthracite treasures that would fuel the Industrial Revolution and provide the basis for the region's steel industry. My own academic specialty is early American literature, which proved helpful when writing the earliest chapters. Within early American studies, there has been a welcome turn to acknowledging the full complexity of the indigenous cultures which lived here before, which is why it was crucial for me to convey that Pittsburgh doesn't begin with the French and English, but goes back much further. The doctrine of the great peacemaker, most likely from upstate New York, who helped forge the Iroquois Confederation, pushes Pittsburgh back into what would be the Middle Ages. Even further back is Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Washington County, the oldest and longest continual habitation in this hemisphere. Pittsburgh's history, I would suggest, is identical with that of America's, before there was either. There are certain moments which inevitably had to be included. The French and Indian War was one such event. Arguably, the First World War, with fighting from the Monongahela to Mumbai, the French and Indian War fought between the British and French alongside their respective native allies over who would have command of the continent's interior, is a demonstration of just how uncertain history happens to be for those who are living it. General Braddock's flabbergasting defeat near the town which now bears his name, the Scottish general and his Virginia regulars, including a young George Washington and Daniel Boone, experienced the equivalent of Thermopylae, and they were the Persians. And they would also go on to win the war, not the French, but the British. The war itself is sometimes taught as mere prelude to the American Revolution, but even more than that, it set the geopolitical course of the subsequent century. In case you happen to be unaware, the United States is currently in the midst of a season of historical reckoning. Movements like Black Lives Matter or the Indigenous Rights Movement have brought a welcome awareness to how much of what the populace at large believes is often mythic, and just how damaging those myths can be to people in the present. To tell the story of Pittsburgh, a city within a settler colonial state that, like the rest of the nation, was founded upon enslavement, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, without admitting to those ugly realities, would be to not tell the story of Pittsburgh at all. I would imagine that almost everybody here knows that soldiers gave Native American women, children, and men blankets infected with smallpox. Probably fewer of you know that the first instance of that happened only a few miles from here at Fort Pitt. Colonel Henry Bouquet, a Swiss officer with the British, consciously distributed smallpox blankets among the Indians with the intention of killing them. His own writings, as you can see here, makes plain that his intent was genocide. In Pittsburgh, we're rightly proud that only a few blocks from here, and Dr. Jonas Salk discovered the polio vaccine. What we should be less proud of is that the buildings in which he did his work sits near Bouquet Street named after that same Swiss colonel, the disease and cure all in a few blocks. Another historical event that couldn't be ignored is the fantastically named Whiskey Rebellion. The name, incidentally, was the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, a founding father of whom maybe a bit too many superlatives have been catchily ascribed. An elitist and at times nascent authoritarian, arguably, Hamilton understood the power of branding, and so the first rebellion against a new constitutional order that had partially snuffed out some of the democratic potential of the Articles of Confederation was reconfigured into just a bunch of drunken country bumpkins. More recently, as reactionary political elements in our current day have been drawn to 18th century imagery, the Whiskey Rebellion is sometimes valorized as a libertarian uprising. It was neither of those things. The reality is far more exciting, for what the Whiskey Rebellion synthesized were radical currents indebted to Jacobinism with apocalyptic religious leanings. With the Whiskey Rebellion, I explore one of my major themes, the ways in which Pittsburgh has often kept burning a surprisingly revolutionary fire. My second major section, Brick and Tired Wood, focuses entirely on the 19th century, where the contours of the Pittsburgh which we're familiar with comes into focus. Steel mills emerge along the rivers, the street names become recognizable, all those men who emblazoned their names across every stone building in this town were alive. If a theme emerged in these chapters, it is of fantastic, tremendous, almost mind-boggling growth and ambiguous power of industrial capitalism checked by the radical promise of the labor movement. Moment of historical reckoning. Many of you are probably familiar with this statue, which used to sit maybe 100 yards or so from where I'm now speaking, right on Forbes Avenue. Rightly taken down in 2018, author Damon Young described the Stephen Foster Memorial, which features the once beloved songwriter writing down the melodies imparted to him by his muse, a shoeless, banjo-playing enslaved man, as, quote, the most racist statue in America. In his essay, Young even joked that the memorial was so over the top in its borderline cartoonish racism that it was actually anti-racist. Foster is a figure who fascinated me because he embodies all of the contradictions of America. By one of those fortuitous coincidences, he was born 50 years to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which happened to be the same day that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died. The passing of one America and the birth of another. Adams, the northerner, and Jefferson, the southerner, were both really Europeans, but Foster was from the West, and thus something new, an American. His depiction of an antebellum South that he had virtually no experience of, and most of all, his filching of black culture, have made Foster a suspect character. Before he squandered it all, Foster was one of the wealthiest composers in America, arguably the father of American pop music, rich from selling his sheet music, if you can believe it. But it was a success purchased at the expense of black Americans. By contrast, we have Martin Delaney, who has no bronze statue, only a small historical marker downtown. Unlike Foster, Delaney had no illusions about life south of the Ohio River, for he'd been born into it, from what is now West Virginia, raised as a free person of color. Delaney would come to Pittsburgh as a young man and establish himself as a physician, a journalist, and the nation's first proponent of a vigorous, full-throated black nationalism. Making his home in the Hill District, Delaney would write and edit his newspaper, The Mystery, which advocated not only for emancipation and not just for equality, but for black self-determination. His attitude towards the abolitionists was that though their goals were admirable, the well-heeled, right-thinking white liberals who constituted the bulk of the movement were irrevocably condescending. And so The Mystery hewed to a far more radical line than William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. Delaney would go on to serve with distinction in the US Civil War, the first black officer, here in his official portrait. No telling of this city's history can overlook some figures who for good or bad indelibly marked the region and the nation. Consider the name of the very building we're in right now. There's no telling the story of Pittsburgh without Andrew Carnegie, for good and for bad. No single character in an alternative history of Pittsburgh appears more often, which is fortunate since he's a fascinating and complicated figure. For many of us with roots in the city, there is, and perhaps I engender heresy by saying this, a certain studied ambivalence concerning the man. So much of the sheer wealth of this area was originally his wealth, the philanthropist who didn't believe in inheritance and so affixed his name to museums, concert halls, universities, and libraries. The same man who ruthlessly prevented his workers, many people in this room might have ancestors who worked in Carnegie Mills, from unionizing. How does one make such a figure simultaneously omnipresent and unknowable new? What fascinates me about our American Croesus is that in a nation which valorizes the self-made businessman, the bootstrapper, the individualist, and where so rarely that story is anything more than a myth, that with Carnegie, it's actually true. Central to the man's own myth were his impoverished origins in Scotland, the son of a weaver who immigrated to the United States, who rapidly mastered the train industry, then iron, then steel, before becoming the richest man in the world. Carnegie made much of his roots, in part drawing on the example of radical working-class Chartists in his own family. I make much of the year of the Carnegie family's arrival, 1848, a year of international revolution throughout Europe, in France, Germany, Italy. 1848 saw the promise of old orders being overthrown, of new ways of doing things, of equality and liberty. This was the environment in which Carnegie was raised. And then those revolutions were terminated, the promise snuffed out for another day. In some sense, Carnegie was a visionary, an idealist, maybe even a utopian, but he was formed in reaction to the failures of his radical father's generation, and the new creed of prosperity which he lived by was a new type of oppression. A group of people who didn't abandon their radical inheritance were strikers of the Baltimore Railroad in 1877, who rioted for several days that summer, part of a massive nationwide series of strikes that brought commerce to its knees. Far less famous than the Homestead Steel Strike of 2 decades later, the Pittsburgh Railroad strike was far more wide-ranging and had a much higher body count as the governor called in the National Guard, 40 confirmed civilian deaths coming out of the melee. It was necessary for the Philadelphia Guard to be called in, as Pittsburghers refused to be called up against their neighbors, friends, family. During the riots, railroad yards and tracks were destroyed. Much of the Strip District was burnt to the ground. The national press feared that the United States was in the midst of a full-blown communist insurrection, while labor journalists enthused that Pittsburgh was the Lexington of the working man's revolution. For all of their initial holding of ground, President Rutherford B. Hayes was able to put down the rebellion. Soldiers who just pulled out of the South as the promise of Reconstruction collapsed, now pacifying Pittsburgh. Another individual who maintained his radical inheritance was Alexander Berkman, anarchist theorist and partner of Emma Goldman, who in 1892 attempted to assassinate Carnegie's former lieutenant, Henry Clay Frick, over his role in the then ongoing Homestead Steel Strike. Shot and stabbed at point-blank range, Frick was back at work only a week later, so like a whiff of sulfur in the air with that. When the Pittsburgh press, largely sympathetic to the strikers, learned of the attempted assassination, there was relief that rather than a Homestead man, it had been an outsider. Of all of the industrialists who made their mark on the city, Carnegie, Westinghouse, Hines, the Mellons, Frick is perhaps the most villainous in his embrace of rapacious, cannibalistic robber baron capitalism. Responsible not just for the violent conclusion of the Homestead Strike, but also for the conditions which made the Johnstown flood possible, Frick, despite copious evidence of his name on many a stone building or park throughout Pittsburgh, never lets us forget that industrial capitalism was based on worker exploitation. Lest it seem as if my book is all battles, strikes, and riots, I should emphasize how much of the story of Pittsburgh is of unexpected cultural significance. From the urban planning of the City Beautiful movement on ample display in Oakland's neoclassical design, to the institutions, museums, libraries, theaters, and orchestras that were established and endured economic downturn when Big Steel collapsed in the last decades of the 20th century. If you're a Pittsburgher, you're used to things like the parks and museums. Perhaps you don't pause to consider how remarkable they are. Yet not only did these institutions partake in the wider cultural life of the nation, they innovated. Some 3 stories above us in this very building was the first modern art museum, later housed in its own wing next door. Carnegie's vision to collect the old masters of tomorrow, which was done in part through the innovative international exhibitions which still occur. Before the Whitney, before MoMA, there was the Carnegie. The final third of my book is entitled The Consequence of America. This is the Pittsburgh which was the most consequential industrial city on earth, that at its height produced more steel and iron than any other location on the planet, and that due to Reaganite economic policies suffered a precipitous collapse by the end of the century, yet weathered those storms as we move into an uncertain future. Pittsburgh is a consequence of America, both because it is the quintessential American city, the forge, kiln, and arsenal of democracy and capitalism, but also because its narrative of decline and possible reinvention mirrors that of the nation of which it is a part. If Pittsburgh was a company town dominated by U.S. Steel, Alcoa, PPG, Koppers, Gulf, and Heinz, then today it's a company town for Pitt, CMU, and UPMC. Of course, the visual symbol of higher education in Pittsburgh is right across Forbes in the form of the spectacular and ridiculous, sublime and mind-boggling, strange and beautiful Cathedral of Learning. So familiar is its golem-like vigil that we perhaps don't appreciate how remarkable it really is. Proposed by the visionary University of Pittsburgh Chancellor John Bowman in 1921, with the groundbreaking in 1926 and the dedication in 1937, the cathedral is a 42-story neo-Gothic skyscraper which, excluding the main building of the University of Moscow, is the tallest educational building on Earth. Here, we have a painting held in the collection of the Carnegie by self-taught artist John Kane of Greenfield, depicting the cathedral and the surrounding neighborhood. Look at everything again after you leave tonight. Rachel Carson wasn't produced in spite of Pittsburgh's notorious smog and pollution. She was formed because of it. Native of bucolic Springdale overlooking the Allegheny, when Carson was an undergraduate English major at Chatham College, she was shocked by the filth of the industrial metropolis. In changing her major from English to biology, Carson changed the world. Pains me to say as an English major. Silent Spring, Carson's most enduring work, which gave not only explanation of the dangers of the pesticide DDT to the public, is with some justification the beginning of the contemporary environmental movement. Any consideration of Pittsburgh's history, and thus of industrial capitalism's history, must consider the role which our region played in the looming ecological catastrophe in the threat of climate change, and to also consider the awareness which Carson promulgated in her books. At the same time that Carson was an undergraduate at Chatham, just a few miles to the west in a very different world based around Center and Wiley Avenues, there had developed in the Hill District a universe of jazz clubs that left an indelible mark on what is America's greatest cultural innovation. At institutions like the Crawford Grill, a dizzying array of luminaries would perform in this black neighborhood, which the Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay called the crossroads of the world. An astounding number of jazz greats were Pittsburghers, often getting their start in music classes at Peabody, Westinghouse, and Fifth Avenue high schools, including Billy Eckstein, Errol Garner, Mary Lou Williams, Art Blakey, Roy Eldridge, Ahmed Jamal, Kenny Clark, Paul Chambers, Ray Brown, Lena Horne, and perhaps the most significant of all, Billy Strayhorn. It was in 1938 when the prodigy met Duke Ellington after a downtown performance and demonstrated for the greatest jazz composer, perhaps the greatest American composer ever, how Ellington's work could be rearranged and improved. For the next 2 decades, Ellington and Strayhorn would be the greatest musical collaborators of the 20th century, and I'm including Lennon and McCartney in that, working together on compositions like Lush Life, Satin Doll, and of course, Take the A Train. One doesn't write a history of Pittsburgh without sports. There are reasons for that, of course. Mario Lemieux's 5 goals in 5 different ways during one game, Franco Harris's immaculate reception, and of course, Bill Mazeroski's 7th game-winning World Series home run just across the street. In my chapter on that particular event, I pivot my attention to another pirate, a figure whom Pittsburgh doesn't deserve. Roberto Clemente was obviously one of the greats, rightly remembered now, his number retired, a bridge named after him, a beautiful museum dedicated to his memory. But when this black and Hispanic player lived in this segregated city, he often faced scorn and derision from his ostensible fans, the newspapers recording his quotes in a mocking phonetic imitation of his Puerto Rican accent. It was Clemente's activism that most deserves our memory. Born poor in San Juan and never forgetting what the score was, Clemente ran relief missions throughout Latin America, bringing food and supplies into countries where his fame and popularity insulated him from local corruption. It was while flying to Nicaragua, his plane overloaded with supplies for earthquake survivors, that Clemente's plane would crash, killing all on board. Perhaps no famous Pittsburgher was quite as ambivalent about his hometown as was Andy Warhol, the greatest American artist of the second half of the 20th century. Raised in South Oakland, less than a mile from here, attendee of art classes within this very building, and educated at Carnegie Tech just across the bridge. Child of Carpatho-Russian immigrants, his family working the mills, and Warhol was thoroughly Pittsburgh. Yet by the time he had become famous, Warhol would joke that he was from nowhere. But I'd argue that no place but Pittsburgh could have produced the Ruthenian, daily mass-going Byzantine Catholic who turned art into a commodity and produced it in a studio with the most Pittsburgh name imaginable, the Factory. Warhol, eccentric, brilliant, queer, chafed at the city's provincialism. And yet the dreams he had of commercial plenty and the glamour of celebrity, of Coke and Campbell's, were thoroughly working-class dreams. Working-class dreams are often synonymous with Pittsburgh, this engine of American capitalism and prosperity, which is why the city remains such a potent rhetorical symbol across partisan divides, but also why industrial collapse is a wound that has yet to heal. I don't mean that we haven't comprehended it in an analytical sense. There are economic, historical, sociological studies that are invaluable, of course. But in a deeper spiritual sense, a lyrical sense, what it means to go from being the most invaluable industrial city in the United States to being in this nebulous category of post-industrial is itself a kind of death. What that death means is the central political question of this century. My last chapter is maybe rather incongruously titled Shadyside Presbyterian, but you'll notice that this photograph of the decaying Carey furnace is not that elegant Romanesque structure off of Fifth Avenue. Rather than focusing on the drama of all of those old mills imploding, my 40th chapter rather focused on protests held at that esteemed and wealthy church, labor activists focusing their attention on an institution whose parishioners in many cases were executives at those very corporations involved in the collapse of steel during the 1980s, thus drawing my narrative to a close with 2 themes that had obsessed me from the beginning: work and conflict. Except that wasn't the end of the book. For in a coda, I retell the entire story of Pittsburgh again by focusing entirely on East Liberty, the first neighborhood I ever lived in. Within East Liberty, I see the nation in miniature. Once an idyllic green space at the edge of the frontier town, a place dedicated to the utopian promise of free grazing. Then purchased and partitioned, where as private property, it became a neighborhood intended for the richest people in America, the wealthiest non-downtown community in the nation. Later, a haven for middle-class immigrants, Europeans and African Americans. Then, as misguided urban renewal led to rampant segregation and economic degradation. Now, over the past 2 decades, development has led to either East Liberty's rebirth or predatory gentrification, depending on your position. In East Liberty, I see an ambiguous allegory about Pittsburgh and America, where all of our major themes can be explored: utopianism and capitalism, race and class, the past and the future, home. In my introduction, I write, if I were a bit more hubristic, then I might lean into that claim concerning the consequence of America, because Pittsburgh is arguably the kiln that made America, and all of its canker and gold, all of its filth and glory. If the city is differentiated from other places, it's that the microscopic view of focusing on Pittsburgh still lends itself to a history of the nation of which it is a part. Manhattan is a metonymy for culture and power, Hollywood with entertainment, Washington with government. Pittsburgh is a metonymy for America. If there was one overreaching argument to an alternative history of Pittsburgh, it's nothing more profound than this is a consequential place. This is an important place. This is a place that matters. Before ending, I'd like to thank Stephanie Flom and everybody at Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures, as well as the Carnegie Library for making this event possible. I'd also like to thank the students and faculty at my alma mater of Taylor Alderdice High School, where I had the wonderful and exceedingly surreal experience of returning for a reading during the year of my 20th reunion. Most importantly, I want to express my gratitude to all of you for coming out tonight, and for everyone who has taken the time to read my book. Life is finite, and I never forget what an honor it is if somebody chooses to spend some of that time reading something which I've written. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you.
And I'm blown away. When Ed and I started talking about tonight, he said he usually does a conversation. And I said, well, our audience really prefers a talk. And he said, well, what if I read the introduction and then have some slides just to kind of pique my memory of, and talk about some of my favorite sections of the book. First of all, you created like a coffee table companion to your, didn't he? It's so beautiful. I want it.
Thank you so much.
I want it. Don't
Thank
you
you.
want it? It's like, and your talk was gorgeous.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And it's, it's so spectacular to be speaking in Pittsburgh to all of you. It's the largest crowd I've had for 2 years. I've been hiding in the basement with sackcloth and ash. So it's nice to be back out. I feel naked without the mask, I'll be honest, but
And our hundreds of folks at home.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we asked our audience, the people who had signed up, if they might like to send in some questions, because we're being COVID safe and not passing a mic around. And Carrie sent in this question that I just think is so good. I'm going to read it, but before you answer, I'm actually going to deconstruct it down to the 5 questions I think it really is.
Okay.
I like your book format very much. Distinct stories in short chapters. Can you share how the format came about? Talk about any tough cuts you had to make or chapters that you added as you went down the Pittsburgh history rabbit hole.
Thank you. No, that's a fantastic question.
Isn't it? So I'm going to break it down.
Okay,
Ready?
okay.
All right. It's just too much.
Sure.
It's so good.
I was trying to memorize it.
I know. Yeah, good for you. Oh, you must have that kind of brain. All right. So she starts with what I think of as vignettes as your format. So can you talk about, did you know going in that you were going to use that format? Did you have a must-have list? You mentioned at least one that was a must-have as you started.
So I think part of the structure, so to begin with, the book was capped at around 40,000 words, which is not a lot of space to work in, but there's a benefit to having less to work with, because I'm normally somebody that likes to include as much as is humanly possible. And if being forced to evaluate what is most crucial or what is most important, having a smaller word count is, I think, beneficial in certain circumstances. So in terms of the structure of having these kind of, I call them fragments, and I've heard people call them vignettes or capsules or whatever, that had come out of a way that I'd been writing at the Millions for a couple years by this point. So the Millions is this literary site that I'm a staff writer at, and they're amazingly tolerant of like weird stuff that I do. They like let me get away with all kinds of odd things. Like I had a piece that came out today that was about like Moroccan trance music, and I was like, I don't even know anything about Moroccan trance music, but apparently, they published this. But one of the essay forms I like are these things I called fragment essays. And basically the idea is that I would have these sort of discrete short vignettes, maybe around 800 words or so, and I'd have about 7 to 10 of them, and they'd be on some really kind of iconic, archetypal sort of subject. So I've done one on like the color black, for example, and every vignette was on something related to that subject from the perspective of science. I wrote about black holes, and then I wrote about Goya, the artist, and his use of black paint, and I wrote about fashion and like the sort of use of black in fashion and those kinds of things. So that way of writing of these kind of fragments was something that I knew I wanted to do. I thought was a way that I could handle something large like Pittsburgh without having to write like the entire history of Pittsburgh in a traditional way. I had originally had this idea where the fragments would be all like discombobulated, like I'd use like dice or tarot cards or something to like mix them all up, which I think was maybe a little too abstract for something like this. So I went with putting them in chronological order. But when I put together the proposal for Ann Trubik, who's a fantastic editor and visionary founder over at Belt, I had come up with a pretty detailed outline of what I wanted to have in, and I knew there were certain things that would have to be included. So like Andrew Carnegie was going to be in there, August Wilson's going to be in there, Rachel Carson's going to be in there, and then there were other things that, not that they are necessarily so unknown, but they're things that were interesting to me that I wanted to include. And part of the idea that I had with this sort of fragment way of writing is that the relationship and the placement of these different things would suggest certain things. So for example, and I only took about 18 or so of the 40 chapters, but the Stephen Foster chapter is right before the Martin Delaney chapter. And that's a conscious choice to try and make some sort of argument in the contrast there that isn't necessarily explicitly stated in a kind of literal way. What was the next one was anything?
So, and I'll add two together. So anything that didn't make the cut or anything that got added because of your research, the surprise.
So two things with that. I had a couple, one of the things with everything that made it in is I wanted it to be representative of some bigger issue. And at a certain point I realized that this is a book that's really a history of America as much as it is a history of Pittsburgh. So I didn't want to have like, the Civil War or something not represented. So it was important that these fragments in some way reflected those bigger kinds of things or those bigger themes. So an example of something that was cut is I had a vignette originally about the B52 Bomber that crashed in the Monongahela River right near the Homestead Steelworks, near the mall, near the waterfront. And I was like, this is a cool story, right? Like everyone, it's kind of a little X-Files-y, and there's, if you're not familiar with it, there had been a military plane in the 50s that had crashed. And a lot of the mill workers had said that boats, barges came and like took all this stuff up in the middle of the night, and people were like, "Oh, it's Area 51 aliens" or something. And I was like, "That'd be fun to put in." And I was like, "This really doesn't have anything to do other than being a cool story," which is oftentimes like good enough, but it didn't work with what I was doing. So that got cut. The one thing that was added was the introduction was originally not part of it. So the book, I had signed my contract in, I think, July of 2019, and I basically finished up in January or February of 2020 and thought, oh, I'm gonna go on a book tour, I'm gonna speak to a live audience, nothing's gonna stop me now. And by about June of that year, we were in lockdown in Washington, D.C., which was even less fun, I was talking to my editor, his name was Dan, who's a fantastic editor. And originally I wanted the book to begin with the 300 million years ago section, what I call the dinosaur chapter, or other people have called the dinosaur chapter. And he was like, you got to place this in some kind of context. He's like, you got to have some charity and explain what you're doing. And he was absolutely right. And a great editor is worth their weight in gold. So that was the last portion of the book that was written, and that came out, like I said, around June of 2020.
And did you always have the Jack Gilbert poem in mind?
I did. Actually, originally, that's another change that was made. So An Alternative History of Pittsburgh was not my original title. At a certain point, it was my subtitle, but I originally wanted it to be called City of Ox and Tired Wood, from the line. I had this very lyrical, poetic idea of what the book would be titled. And Anne very astutely was like, no one's going to have any idea what this book is about. And so they went with An Alternative History of Pittsburgh, and I was like, that's fine. We'll do that. I think it's worked a lot better. I think they were right in that regard.
Yeah. Well, the book, in addition to using the poem, is just so poetic. And
Thank you.
Pieces that you put up on the screen just felt like prose poems.
Oh, thank you so much. That's incredibly generous of you to say.
I just call it like I see it. Okay, so Pittsburgh. So I'm also just wondering, have you just always breathed Pittsburgh history? It seems like this wasn't like I don't know anything about Pittsburgh and I want to learn and you opened up a lot of books. So it seems like a lot of this is just stuff you've lived and breathed all your life. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I think that anywhere I've lived that's not Pittsburgh, people would say that's that Pittsburgh guy. I think that's been, if there's one intrinsic part of my identity, I'm very much like, did you know that in Pittsburgh there's more bridges and blah, blah, blah. One less, but there's still more, And I think I always had a sense that I wanted to write a Pittsburgh book. So I had started my first year of college at Washington and Jefferson. Go Presidents, most ridiculous mascot of any school, but go Presidents. I had a Pittsburgh novel that I'd written called 14th Ward, and it's probably in my mom's basement molding right now where it should stay. And I think that An Alternative History of Pittsburgh is like the much shorter child of that book, intellectually. I always wanted to sort of do this Pittsburgh book. In terms of Pittsburgh history, I will say, and this was definitely a fear I had writing this book, Pittsburghers are very knowledgeable about Pittsburgh history. Pittsburghers know, and it goes beyond, that's always the joke where you give directions in Pittsburgh by you turn right where the Isleys was in 1955, that kind of thing. But it goes beyond, people are like, well, you go left where the Iron Forge was in 1793. Pittsburghers know their history. And I don't know if people remember this, but maybe it's like a fever dream because it's so weird. I'm sure it sounds almost not true, but when I was in the 3rd grade, we had a Pittsburgh history class that we had to take. Mm-hmm. And there was a book that the Pittsburgh Public Schools had written, and it was about these kids who took art classes at the Carnegie. And they would wait at the bus stop out on Forbes Avenue, and an old wise man would come out, and he would tell them stories of yore. And that was the frame tale, and it was from Fort Pitt onward. And it ended with Pittsburgh in the future. It's Pittsburgh in 2020 with flying cars, and perfect infrastructure. But I can't think of any other area that is history saturated in quite that way. And I lived in New England for 2 years, and New Englanders know their history. I'm not gonna say New Englanders don't know their history, but just the beautiful weirdness of this book that was taught in the public schools is fantastic. So I think that this was the audience I was writing for, and I was very cognizant of a lot of this is familiar to Pittsburghers. And Pittsburghers are a tough audience too. That was Terry Bradshaw cried himself to sleep every night, and he was Terry Bradshaw. So I feel honored that people have been relatively charitable about things. But no, I always knew that I wanted to write a Pittsburgh book, and I think that there's a lot of Pittsburgh books out there in other Pittsburghers too. Yeah.
So I love that you said that when you go other places, everyone calls you the Pittsburgh guy. So this question was, what does that mean to you, being from Pittsburgh, being a Pittsburgher?
That's such a good question. That's such a hard question too, because I feel like those are like the elemental metaphysical questions that really get you. You know, I think that so much of what my identity is as a Pittsburgher is something that's like a little intangible and a little ineffable and kind of hard to put into words, which was maybe part of why I wrote the book. I think that there's oftentimes a very stereotypical image of Pittsburgh, that kind of like blue collar, shot in a beer town sort of place, which is absolutely part of Pittsburgh, 100% part of Pittsburgh, and a proud and great part of Pittsburgh. But Pittsburgh's more complicated than that, and it's kind of more strange than that in a way too. And I think that part of Pittsburgh is you're your own place, right? Because Pittsburgh's not the East Coast, it's just not. But also when I'm on the East Coast proper, I have to tell people it's definitely not the Midwest either. It's absolutely 100% in no way. Like, have you driven down Negley? It's not the Midwest, right? It is its own strange, and I'm going to use the word liminal, which is an awful graduate school word, but it's this liminal kind of space that's like sort of in between, and it's its own unique and very beautifully weird place. And I think one of the things I love about being from Pittsburgh is, for all of its failures, and there are many, there is still kind of a tolerance for weirdness, and maybe not as much as there should be, but there's a type of like eccentric way of being in Pittsburgh that I don't pick up in other places. And I feel like, you know, whenever people say, keep Boulder weird or keep Austin weird, I don't think it would occur to us here. We'd be like, what do you mean? Pittsburgh's not weird. And then we'd like get in our unicycle and like drive down the street. It's just its own very different kind of place. And I think it's like a perspective or an understanding. The only place that has had a similar type of worldview, I find, is for 6 months I lived in Glasgow, Scotland. And Glasgow, you know, Scottish city, and of course Pittsburgh, heavily Scottish city, at least originally. And they have like a lack of pretension that I find that Pittsburgh has historically had. You know, so in Glasgow, they have the beautiful Gallery of Modern Art. It's this beautiful old Georgian building. It had been a bank or something. It's turned into this great museum. And they have a statue of like the Duke of Wellington, this like hated English Duke, in front of it. And somebody puts a traffic cone on his head every night. And they take it down, and for like 50 years, they haven't been able to stop that. And so the city's just like, whatever. And they change it all the time. And it's just, that seems very quintessentially Pittsburgh to me, but, you know, in a brogue.
Yeah, that's great. Well, some folks here were with us last month for Douglas Stewart, and he talked a lot about the similarities between Glasgow and Pittsburgh, and we learned that Glasgow is our sister city, and there was a group from the sister city, so there you go.
That makes total sense to me, yeah.
Right on it. I also have the sense, other than this coffee table book that I just invented, that...
Which, Anne, if you're listening, we're doing the coffee table book.
Which is his publisher at Bell. Is there another Pittsburgh book coming down, or at least in your mind or your fantasy?
There is, I think, at some point. I am always toggling between projects, but I do want to return to another Pittsburgh book. And one of the things I've been thinking about is something that would maybe be a little bit more personal in some sense, not a memoir in any way, because nobody should have to read that. And also, I'm a little allergic to the first person for the most part. But I would like to write something that is maybe an opportunity to write longer essays on subjects. And not, I mean, that I would deal with history, but it wouldn't have that chronological structure to it. And I'd kind of focus in on various themes or subjects or personages or literature or whatever. And I'm kind of thinking of it as like exploring and really answering that question of what does Pittsburgh identity mean to me. So kind of a like, you know, soul of a Yinzer kind of thing, I think is what I've been thinking of for it. So I've been bouncing some ideas around and outlining some things, but there's nothing official yet. So hopefully sometime not too far in the future, there'll be another volume that's another Pittsburgh book.
That's great. Well, that would be a great place to stop, but I'm not going to let you stop because I want to keep asking at least one more question. And I do want to let everyone know that Ed has very graciously agreed to do a book signing. So we'll put the book table right there, and you'll meet Caitlin at the corner, and we'll have a COVID-safe book signing. So thank you for that. I also wanted to let everyone know, I don't know if I'm allowed to, but he shared with me that he's moving back to Pittsburgher. So the soul of a Pittsburgher is coming back.
If anyone's taking job applications, I'm not joking. Yeah, all right.
Banding. Yes, gum
It's
banding.
true. I just
gum
got that.
banding.
It took me a
That's great.
second.
I know, it took me a
Oh,
second
yeah.
too. Thank you, gum banding. Huh. All right, last question. And again, this is like going to be I don't know. Anyway, you did such a thorough job capturing our complex, and as you said, often less than beautiful, sometimes betrayals, story of our city. You referred to the colonizing by Silicon Valley. You referred to the defanging by the New York Times. So, Ed, what gives you hope for our city?
I suppose now I can't get a job at Google. No, that's a fantastic question. I think one of the things. So, and when I talked to the the students at Alternative today, and I'd said that when I was growing up and when I had moved away or traveled away and talked about Pittsburgh, that sometimes there was something I called the Pittsburgh cringe, that we had a bit of a an embarrassment about Pittsburgh, and that we were sometimes the butt of jokes to an extent. And the story I told them, I remember I went to go see Apollo 13. If it's Tom Hanks, so you've all seen Apollo 13. And I saw it at the Showcase East.
It's Shanley Park on the hill.
Yeah, no, it was Monroeville, but still very. And there's a line in that, and if you haven't seen the movie, it's about a space capsule that is endangered. But one of the NASA characters says, right now people are about as excited about a trip to the moon as they would be for a vacation to Pittsburgh. And literally people stood up and screamed expletives at the screen and walked out. And there's that very Pittsburghers can make fun of Pittsburghers, but don't, who are you, Tom Hanks? You will never play Mr. Rogers. And so I was telling these students this, and they were confused by that at first. And they were but Pittsburgh's cool. They're I was yeah, Pittsburgh is cool. But they had no idea that Pittsburgh couldn't be cool. So there was a certain amount, I had hope at one point, I think, when Pittsburgh became cool. And I think there's a lot that's great about Pittsburgh being cool. And I'm happy about a lot of the stuff that makes Pittsburgh cool. The food's better now,
yes.
On the whole. It was great before, but it's better now. And we've always had fantastic cultural institutions. Is something that I say is it's not a cultural rebirth in the last 20 years. We've had the International. That's part of why I wanted to make that point as well. But there's, I think, a dynamism to Pittsburgh in terms of the arts and writers and musicians that comes out of the fact that it is bluntly an affordable city and a welcoming city. And I think that that's been incredible. I also think as things have moved, as politics have changed and people have reevaluated some things, I've been really heartened by kind of a new progressive awakening in the city, where I think, when Pittsburgh got cool again, it was awesome that they were there's a new brew pub, that's fun, and I'm glad that's there, but that's obviously, the road to heaven is not paved by brew pubs alone. And so I've been happy to see that I think that there's a younger generation of people who are activists, who are advocating for change in movements like Black Lives Matter and other sort of progressive movements. And I've really been heartened to see that kind of change as well. And I think that there's a way in which this is a city that's kind of, a very a progressive kind of island that's really important. So I have a lot of hope that comes out of that as well.
Thank you. Ed Simon with Alternative History of Pittsburgh.
Thank you.